everywhere. I'm actually not just standing here. I was waiting for a signal from the booth up there. We are recording the program. If you get home and it's so good you want to watch it again, or if you have friends that can't be here, be sure and let them know it's on our YouTube channel. So thank you very much for being here. As you probably have figured out, we have resumed our Thursday programs at a new time every Thursday. Yeah, it's really great to be back, I have to say. Every Thursday at 4:30, in for a special treat today. Next Thursday is a program on re-registering your livestock brands. Some of you may or may not have livestock brands. It's a talk I've actually heard before, and it's quite interesting. Probably maybe a little more pertinent if you have a brand, if you have cattle that you want to keep track of. But even if not, it's a fun talk. And then the week after that, we have a expert in Czech immigration, a man from the Czech Republic, who is kind of on a little mini speaking tour of Montana, and he'll be talking about Czech immigrants in the Northwest in Montana. So that should be a special treat as well. Tonight, it is my pleasure, or this afternoon, I should say, it is my pleasure to introduce Jerry Enzler, who, as I'm sure you all know by now, has written a new book on Jim Bridger that has been received critical praise. Lots of good things have been said about it. I won't go into all of that because you're not here to listen to me. But I will tell you that this book was published earlier this year by the University of Oklahoma Press. And it's full of new information on Bridger, who was one of America's greatest frontiersmen. Mr. Enzler is the founder and now president emeritus of the National Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium, which is a 14-acre Smithsonian-affiliated museum in Dubuque, Iowa. He is an award-winning writer and speaker, and the museum there exhibits and films that he and his staff have created have been viewed by over 4 million people. So I think we have somebody who knows what he's talking about and how to talk. So one other piece of business, if we have any teachers in the audience, teacher renewal units for OPI, I'll just set this over there on the table, and after the talk you can sign that. Anyway, help me in welcoming Jerry Enzler.
Well, thank you very much. I know you all know of Jim Bridger. Here's a question for you, though. How many of you have read one of the biographies that were previously published about Jim Bridger? Okay. So that means there's not a lot of debunking I have to do because only one of you has read the earlier version. The earlier versions are good for their time, but their time was 1946, and there was another book that was written in 1925, modified in 1950, and then rewritten in 1962, all by the same author. So without being boastful, I'm trying to say that there's a lot of new information here, and you cannot always necessarily trust what's in those books because they didn't have the advantage of modern scholarship and digital access to archives. And I did. I visited personally over 30 archives. I visited the National Archives. It was easy to do because my family lived in D.C. I visited that 25 times in researching this, and I had a wonderful time doing it. And it's wonderful to be here with you. We're talking about Jim Bridger, and many people know Jim Bridger as a fur trader, trapper, or brigade leader. He also had two other lives, if you will, or two other professions. One was running and managing a fort, Fort Bridger, and then a third one is being a guide, chief guide, to a whole big number of map makers, Smithsonian scientists, Army commanders. And so through that period, 1804 to 1881, he had a 77-year life. He spent the majority of it out there in this region, in the West, from 1822 to 1868. So you're talking about 46 years out here. He's a remarkable figure. And you may not know this is one of the facts that's introduced in the book. When the Mount Rushmore was planned, the original plan by Doane Robinson, the head of the South Dakota Historical Society, was that these would be Western heroes. And they would be not on actual what they call Mount Rushmore now, but it would be on something adjacent to it called the Pinnacles, and these are needle rocks, and they would be carved into the image of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark and Sacagawea and John Coulter and Jim Bridger and John C. Frémont and Buffalo Bill Cody. And that was to be our Mount Rushmore. And I say that, not that I'm jealous of the fact that the presidents got there, but I say that to note that in the 1920s, Bridger had been 50 years deceased by that time, and he was still considered one of the great American heroes of the American West. And I firmly believe that, and I brought a lot of that to light in this book, and that's why I wrote it, because I want to restore the story of his life. And so at times I'm going to talk about the things that he did that impacted American history. And at other times I'm going to talk about his personality. What did he look like? What was his family life like? So I'm going to bounce back and forth between knowing him as a person and knowing the kind of things that Jim Bridger did. When Bridger was 8 years old, his family said that they were going to move from Richmond, Virginia to the American Bottom, which is in Illinois. It's now Cahokia and East St. Louis. And that was about as far as you could go before getting to the Louisiana Purchase territory. But at that time, it was 1812, which was the exact same time that United States began its second war with Great Britain. And so as the Bridger family was moving along more or less the southern tier through the Cumberland Gap, along the Ohio River, maybe Louisville, Kentucky, north of them, there were battles taking place, and the British captured Michilimackinac, and they captured Fort Detroit, and they captured Chicago, which is an Indian name meaning onion field. And what was happening for the settlers who did settle in the American Bottom, they live in a place called 6 Mile Prairie, 6 miles from St. Louis. 6 Mile Prairie, the Potawatomis were looking for a chance to finally get some of their land back. The Americans had moved into Indiana and Illinois, and they had lost so much land, they thought this was an opportunity to ally themselves with the British and do raiding on families. And so Bridger and his family, Bridger is, as I said, eight years old. Bridger is, they had to go to a blockhouse or a fortification that had been built maybe every 10 miles, and all the people living in the American Bottom did that. Whereas the governor of Illinois Territory, he was able to send his children back to Kentucky where they could be safe, but that wasn't available to Bridger himself. But I want to read a little bit from the book, and then I'm going to show some pictures. So after living years 8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old through the War of 1812, being very much afraid of the Potawatomis, suddenly Jim Bridger is living now with the Potawatomis. How did that happen? When Bridger was 12, his mother died. When Bridger was 12, his brother died. When Bridger was 13, his father died. So it's just now Jim and his sister. We don't know her first name. We don't know if she's an older sister or a younger sister. But Bridger had to do something to help support her, and so he started working on a flatboat, which presumably went across the Mississippi River. It was a ferry boat, we know that for sure. And then he apprenticed, and the early biographies say that he apprenticed to a St. Louis blacksmith. Well, that's very faint praise. Jim Bridger apprenticed to the most significant gunsmith in the whole Midwest. That man's name was Philip Kramer. And Bridger was a blacksmith helping Kramer make these rifles. And it's said that if you were going to fight a duel on Bloody Island, which was an island between St. Louis and East St. Louis, and so it was under neither jurisdiction, that's why they went to the island. If you're going to do that, the smart person, it said in the paper, would actually go to Kramer and buy the pistols there because they were the finest shooting pistols anywhere in that region. So this is what 12-year-old Jim Bridger is learning from, this master gunsmith. That's a whole new idea about what Jim Bridger's early life was. And then the second new bit of information is that we know that Philip Kramer was appointed to the Illinois Indian Agency, but we didn't know where that was and who that was. We know now that Kramer and Bridger started from the bottom of the Illinois River, the mouth of it, and they went up the Illinois to a place called Peoria, which is also an Indian name. And that's where there was a village of the Potawatomis, the same Indians who he had been frightened of for the past 3 years. And there was some Kickapoo there as well. And so I'm going to read from the book. While Bridger was helping shape iron, in other words, to help Kramer, his life among the Potawatomis was undoubtedly shaping him. He had seen his family and neighbors live in fear of the Potawatomis and other Indians throughout the war. Now, living among them and interacting with them and their families, Bridger was introduced to a peaceful coexistence that he would come to embrace. And that's one of the themes of this book. He fought when he needed to fight, and he definitely fought when he needed to defend himself, but he didn't deliberately attack indigenous peoples, Native Americans. He tried to live peacefully with them throughout his entire life. A famous want ad was put in the St. Louis newspapers to enterprising young men. They were looking for 100 men to ascend the river Missouri to its source and there to trap beaver for 1 or 2 or 3 years. Is Bridger going to be one of these people who wants to do this? He's now 17 years old when this ad appears. Bridger cannot read nor write. So it must have been told to him by others, because Bridger actually did end up as part of this expedition. And I write, some trappers, in response to this ad, some trappers saw themselves building their fortunes on beaver pelts. Wives and sisters saw their men disappearing to a land of Indians and grizzlies, perhaps never to return. Did Bridger sign up for such an adventure to escape the expectations or even the exclusions of civilization? Was it to make his fortune, or was it to take the measure of the new land and make it his new home? Bridger did go up the river. Let's see, I have to do that first. And he became a trapper. And there would be maybe 60 men on a keel boat, and they would go up the Missouri River. There'd be another 40 on a land party. When they get out up to the mouth of the Yellowstone, there's 100 of them at least. But then they have to break into parties of just 2 at a time. And so the paintings I'm going to show you, almost all of them are from Alfred Jacob Miller, who did his sketching in 1837, and then turned these into wonderful dynamic paintings. This painting is called Preparing for the Buffalo Hunt. And they soon found buffalo that they're out west, and what an exciting thing that was. It was a tremendously exciting opportunity to leap onto your horse and race after the buffalo and maybe race among them. And that's what Bridger and others were able to do. And most trappers and traders, they had a buffalo horse, which was different than any other horse because it's one that was used to running alongside the buffalo without getting too frightened. So here is a map to show a little bit about where they went. So St. Louis is over here. Here's the Missouri River going up here. And they got to this point here at the mouth of the Yellowstone, where the Yellowstone flows into the Missouri, and they established Fort Henry in 1822. And then they went to land parties. They did take one keelboat up one of these rivers, but the rest of them, they went by horse up the Yellowstone and up the Milk and up the Muscle Shell and the Missouri and others, and they started trapping. But it was a dangerous time for them because their primary opponent was with the Blackfeet Indians. And there were 3 bands of the Blackfeet, and they were all very much satisfied with their trading with the Hudson Bay Company, who are more or less operating in this region, Oregon and Washington now. And so this became known as the Bloody Missouri. I think chapter 1 is titled To Find a Home. Chapter 2 is the Bloody Missouri, and it talks about all the things that happened, including Mike Fink was actually killed by one of his companions. And Mike Fink is a real character. He was captain of the keelboat that went up the river with Jim Bridger. Okay, so here they are crossing a river with a bull boat. And a bull boat is what you do when you don't have lumber and nails. You take buffalo hides and you wrap them around willows, and then you make a round bowl, and that's the way you would cross a river. Bridger became an expert at this, and throughout his life, he was able to make these, including for scientists from the Smithsonian. They had all these animal specimens which they needed to get up the Yellowstone River. So Bridger had the soldiers, he told them how to make a bull boat that was maybe 5-6 feet wide, but was like 20 feet long. So it was more of an elongated one, which he did. Another time, Reynolds, he was guiding Reynolds, and Reynolds said, no, we're going to cross this flooded stream. It happened to be the Snake River. You know where the bridge is, just south of Jackson Hole, I think it's in the town of Wilson. It was right at that spot. And it was so high, Bridger said, we'll make bull boats and we'll cross it that way. And Captain Reynolds said, no, we're going to find a way. I'll send men to find a way we can ford across. A man died trying to do that. And then Bridger said, would you like me to make a bull boat? And Captain Reynolds said, no, we're going to build rafts. And Bridger said, that's not going to work. And they tried the rafts and they immediately sunk, and that didn't work. And then he said, would you please build us some bull boats? And it took them a while to get across. But see, he had an uncanny knowledge of how to survive in the West. He could not read or write, but he was an extremely intelligent man. This is a scene called Hunting Elk. And elk was a very important game animal for them. And there was a time later in life where Bridger was actually not feeling so very well. And Captain Reynolds said, across the river there is an elk. I saw it there. And so Bridger immediately took his rifle and he went across and he killed the elk and came back and he said, you better bring a wagon and 4 men because this one is huge. So without the head, without the legs, it still weighed over 1,000 pounds for one elk, which is a very large size elk. I'm told. I'm not an elk hunter, but those of you who are, that's pretty big, isn't it? I thought so. This is the lost trapper. This could also happen to Bridger and to other people. Bridger, when he was young, actually, he saw these eyes gleaming in the firelight, and he thought he was on guard duty. They were on the Green River. He thought that it might be Indians trying to attack. He shot at it, and it turned out to be one of their mules. So he was pretty chagrined at that, and I think had to pay for that mistake. So he certainly wasn't perfect in many, many respects, but his story is so interesting to tell. And storytelling is what Jim Bridger did too. As I said, these brigades were maybe 100, maybe 80 men, maybe 20 Indian women that were traveling with them. They were wives or partners, and there were some children as well. And they weren't just all people from Kentucky or Virginia or New York. There were also people from Mexico. There were French Canadians from Canada. There were people who had immigrated from Ireland. People came from Germany. Some of them found their way to be one of these enterprising young men, 100 men to want to go up. And Bridger soon became a very significant leader of that. I want to go back to the map because there's 3 things that Bridger did very early in his life, which I think are kind of remarkable. When Bridger was 20 years old, he went up the river when he was 18. When he was 20 years old, he discovered Great Salt Lake. How did that happen? Let's see. Okay, so here's Salt Lake. Here's the Bear River beginning here, flowing out of the mountains, and it's going north. Suddenly it's starting to go west, and now it's starting to go south. And the trappers start to wonder which way it's going, and then they start to fight about it and argue about it. And then now they're betting money on it. And they either said, Bridger, you are going to do this, or Bridger said, I will do this, but I will follow the Bear River at 20. And so he did by himself, and he went down the Bear and went through Bear Canyon and came to Great Salt Lake. And others had known about the fact that there was a huge lake there, but they had not tasted it, they had not been close enough to know that it was a lake of salt. It was Bridger who had discovered that at age 20. They had a rendezvous system. I said earlier that they used to go up and down the Missouri River. Well, that was dangerous. So now they started going overland along the North Platte and across South Pass, and they started a rendezvous system every year in the summer. That's what all these little circles are. There were 16 rendezvous from 1825 to 1840. The first one is 1825, and there were $50,000 worth of beaver pelts that had to be taken from the rendezvous area, which is about here. The plan was to go follow down the Bighorn and then down the Yellowstone. And just for those of you who are like me when I first started, the Bighorn flows this way. That's why you say down the Bighorn, even though you're going north. You're also going north here up the Yellowstone, but you're not. You're going down the Yellowstone because that's the way of the flow. So that's the language that they would use, and we all need to use that. Anyway, there's a spot called, maybe you've heard of it, Bad Pass. Who's heard of Bad Pass on Bighorn? 2 or 3. As early as 1805, the Crow had said that is one of the most treacherous places. Do not go through Bad Pass. There is an evil spirit, a Manitou, which will destroy your boat and kill you. Well, William Ashley needed to know whether he could take this $50,000 of beaver pelts either by land through Bad Pass or more treacherous on the water that goes between these hugely tall canyons. When you're down in the bottom on the water of Bad Pass, you only see the sun during the noon hour, only when it's directly overhead. Otherwise, you are in shade that whole time. Bridger was the first one known in history to go through a solo version or voyage through these Bad Pass Rapids. He did that at age 21. Also at 21, he had to decide, is he going to stay in the mountains? Because the ad said 1, 2, or 3 years. It's now been 3 years at 1825, from age 18 to now 21. He does decide that he's going to stay, and so they go west, and around in this region here, they run into the Bannocks, and the Bannocks stole some of their horses. Someone needed to go back and get those horses back. 1, because you need them to survive, and 2, because you can't let them start stealing horses because they'll steal them every day if you don't go back. 2 men stepped forward, Tom Fitzpatrick, who was 26 years old, Jim Bridger, who was 21 years old. Tom Fitzpatrick, his role was to, from a distance, have his men fire over the heads of the people in the village, the Bannock village. And that would distract them, that would make them start shooting back. Bridger then, as 21, leading men who were probably 30 and 40 years old, he led them directly to the village and to untie the horses and to ride away with their horses and steal the horses back. So he was a person of incredible enthusiasm for the frontier and for getting something done, and he did it very, very well. This is a gathering in a Shoshone village, or excuse me, a Shoshone lodge. That's what they called their homes. So here's one of the American trappers. He has a long Catlinite pipe. He might be talking in sign also with that hand there. There's an Indian woman here, a Shoshone woman with a young child. Looks like a woman and a man there. There were a lot of unions created, marriages, if you will, between these mountaineers like Jim Bridger and the native peoples. And Bridger had 3 Indian wives. His first one was named Cora. She was a Flathead woman, also called Salish. She and Jim Bridger had 3 children, and then she was bitten by a wolf, according to family tradition, who was rabid, and she then ran off and never came back. Then Bridger married a Ute woman, and her name was Chipeta. And by this time, this was like 1847, 48. So Bridger would have been like 43 years old. And they had 1 child, Virginia. She lived the longest of all of Bridger's children. She didn't die until the 1920s. But she did die, I'm talking about Virginia. Virginia's mother died. Chipeta died just about 2 weeks after giving birth. So then a few years later, Bridger married a Shoshone woman. Her name was Mary. And she lived from married 1850 to, I think it was 1857 or 58. And there were also 3 children of that marriage. So he had 7 children, 3 wives, but consecutively, not concurrently, and really embraced, and this I harken back to the fact that he had lost his parents. He saw family life among the Potawatomis. And he might have seen that as what he wanted for his life, to be out here in the West. This is an Indian called Eagle Ribs. And we know about eagle ribs because George Catlin painted this painting in 1832. And they were at Fort Union, which is the same place where Fort Henry was built, at the mouth of the Yellowstone and the Missouri. And so George Catlin goes up the Missouri and he paints eagle ribs, and he explains that eagle ribs has not one medicine bundle, but two medicine bundles. That means he's a man of great distinction. He is part of the Buffalo Society. He wears the buffalo horns on his head, which means he is one of the highest elite of the blood people, the blood Blackfeet. He also told Catlin that he wears 8 scalps of white men, white trappers and traders that he personally had killed. So Bridger comes up against eagle ribs in 1832, the fall of 1832. So Bridger's leading maybe 70 of his trappers. He also has some Delaware Indians and Iroquois Indians. They've got wives with them as well. On the other side, you have eagle ribs and maybe an equal number of people. And so Bridger rides up on his horse. Eagle ribs comes forward walking. And this is just maybe 14 months after Catlin has drawn this painting and heard about the 8 scalps. So Bridger hears some commotion and he thinks something's happening, so he cocks his rifle. And eagle ribs is standing below, and so he grabs the rifle barrel and points it down so it's not pointing at him, which makes the rifle discharge, which makes eagle rib grab the rifle and tear it from Bridger's arms and whack him over the head with it on the back of the neck and the back of the head. And Bridger fell down, and as he was falling, he got 2 arrows in the back. And later on, Casper, Wyoming is named after Casper Collins. They just changed the AR to ER. And in the 1860s, Bridger talked to Casper Collins, young Casper Collins, and said that at that moment, it was the hardest he had ever been hit, and he very likely could have died from that. 2 arrowheads in his back. When the dust settles and the battle is no longer going on, his men come forward and they were able to pull 1 arrow out. The other did not come out. The shaft came out, but the point did not. And so there's always been in literature, there's been a description of Marcus Whitman taking the arrow out of Bridger's, the second arrow out of Bridger's back at the 1835 rendezvous. There's just been that one description by another missionary who was out there with Marcus Whitman. But as part of this research, I discovered another account which shows how painful this must have been for Bridger. Jonathan Keeney, who had come out to the mountains in 1831 to work under Bridger, remembered the operation. Quote, "The doctor cut deep into the sores around the arrow point with a sharp knife and inserted some instrument like a pair of pincers." By the way, now, so Bridger is laying down prone on the ground. They've pulled his buckskin shirt up. Everybody's gathered around to see this spectacle. The Indians are amazed that someone's going to cut in like that. Everyone's amazed, and they want to see what's going to happen. The point had struck a bone and had partly clinched around a rib, and that required the strength of 2 men to pull it out, and Bridger had to be held down. He bore the operation with only a slight groan or two, and the point actually straightened out when it gave way. So that's the operation on Jim Bridger. Now that arrowhead has a longer life because one of Bridger's friends was a Scotsman by the name of Sir William Drummond Stewart. And he came as a tourist because he wanted to see the mountain men, these mountaineers. And so he was there and he witnessed this operation. In 1857, now we're talking about 22 years later, he's over in Scotland, in his castle, Merthley Castle in Perthshire, Scotland. And he said, and he describes this incident of getting the arrow out. And he said, and as I write this book right today, I have that same arrowhead in my pocket in my castle here in Scotland. So he kept it as a souvenir. I went looking for it, and the laird now, he said, no, we've already looked for that, and it's not there. But we did see a lot of other things that had been piled up in one of the turrets of the castle. It was a wonderful experience, but we didn't find the arrowhead. So that was one of the most dangerous times in Bridger's life. Another dangerous time, moving a little bit ahead in history, In 1855, Bridger was on a steamboat going from Kansas City down to St. Louis, where his children were being, actually St. Charles, where they were being raised and schooled. And they hadn't gotten very far, maybe a day or two out of St. Louis, and Bridger contracted pneumonia, and they thought he was going to die. They put him off the boat, and they put him in a home where he could either die or recuperate. And they also thought he was going to die. But it turns out he did recuperate and got back on the steamboat and then came down to St. Louis and did see his children. So he almost died then. He almost died 2 years earlier when the Mormons took his fort in 1853. But I'm getting a little out of a chronicle here. This is Fort, well, it was known as Fort William, and it was built by William Sublette. But everyone called it Fort Laramie because it was on the Laramie River. It was built in 1837. Or it was built in 1834. In 1835, Jim Bridger owned this fort, along with Tom Fitzpatrick and some others. There's the interior view of that same fort. This is one of the rendezvous. This is the rendezvous of 1837. And the rendezvous was a time where these trappers had been out here in the West the entire time, since the last rendezvous 12 months earlier. And then a caravan of goods came, and that provided coffee. They hadn't had coffee for months. They hadn't had tobacco. They hadn't had whiskey. They hadn't even had pants. And one of these, they had leather pants, but someone actually sent Bridger, tell Mr. Bridger I'm sending him a pair of pantaloons, which is what pants were called. It's hard to imagine the brave Jim Bridger wearing pantaloons, but there it is. That's what they were called at the time. And so I'm going to read a little bit about what they're seeing here. This Alfred Jacob Miller, who did this painting, said, "The whole plain is dotted with lodges and tents, groups of Indians surrounding them. In the midst of them is Captain Bridger," he's in the foreground here, "in a suit of armor. This gentleman was a famous mountain man. We venture to say that no one has traveled here within the last 30 years without seeing or hearing of him." William Stewart likened Bridger and his men as if King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Stewart purchased a unique gift for Bridger, ordering it from Britain, shipping it to St. Louis, then carrying it carefully boxed to the rendezvous, this polished steel helmet and the cuirass. Here's a close-up. It's not terribly good because it's just a close-up of that same painting, but you see him there standing. You may wonder what he might look like. I also have someone who actually did a description, and we're going to find out what that face looks like in just a moment. So Stewart came not only with this gift for Bridger in 1837. This is the same one with the arrowhead in his pocket. He also brought in Scottish wines and whiskeys, and he brought other unique gifts for some of the greatest leaders. And Bridger, by the way, hardly ever sat in a chair. He would sit on the ground. He would sit on a rock. He'd sit on a rail, and occasionally a chair. But it says here in the book, quoted from Stewart, "On the right of Captain Stewart sat, or rather squatted in Oriental fashion, one of the most remarkable men of this remarkable assemblage." This was Jim Bridger, the leader of the beaver hunting parties. He had a thorough acquaintance of the whole mountain region. He had a complete and absolute understanding of the Indian character based on his own large experience. To sum up, his bravery was unquestionable, his horsemanship equally so, and as to his skill with a rifle, he has been known to kill 20 buffaloes by the same number of consecutive shots. The physical conformation of this man is admirable: tall, 6 feet at last, muscular, without an ounce of superfluous flesh. His cheekbones were high, his nose hooked or aquiline, the expression of his eye mild and thoughtful, and that of his face grave almost to solemnity. So that's the closest you're going to get in his early life, in his 30s, what he looked like. These people, they called themselves not mountain men, but mountaineers. And Washington Irving writes about Jim Bridger and Captain Bonneville and all these other men this way: "A totally different class has now sprung up. The mountaineers, the traders, the trappers who scale the vast mountain chains and move from place to place on horseback. Heedless of hardship, daring of danger, prodigal of the present, and thoughtless of the future. There is perhaps no class of men on the face of the earth who lead a life of more continued exertion, peril, and excitement. So that's Washington Irving, maybe getting a little overdone with the adjectives, I don't know. But anyway, good writing. This is Thomas Fitzpatrick. I'm going to go ahead and find Fort Bridger. This is Fort Bridger, built in 1843. There were two forts before that. There was one built in 1841 on the Green River, where the Green and the Sandy meet. And that was a time where Bridger was not partnered with Louis Vasquez, but was partnered with Henry Frapp. And Frapp died. He and many of the Shoshone were making meat, they called it. And they were killing buffalo and drying the meat. And the Sioux attacked mainly the Shoshone, but they also killed Henry Frapp at the same time. So Bridger knew three things. One, he didn't have Henry Frapp as a partner. He needed a new one, and that was going to be Louis Vasquez. Two, this was not a safe place for his oldest daughter, and it's about time that she would have some schooling. She was 6 years old. So he sent her to the Whitman mission, and unfortunately, 6 years later, she died as a result of the attack, the Whitman massacre. And three, that this was not a good place for a fort, so he moved to the current site of Fort Bridger. The second Fort Bridger was built on a ridge overlooking what's now the current Fort Bridger. The third Fort Bridger was built in 1843, and that's this one. This was not in the United States territory. This was in Mexico. 4 years later, when Brigham Young and 100 plus came out to start settlement in Utah, they were also settling in land that was not the United States. It was Mexico. But the Mexican War ended in 1848, and suddenly Bridger's Fort and the whole Utah settlements of the Church of Latter-day Saints was now part of the United States. And Brigham Young was leading a theocracy. It was a both combined democracy, if you will, but based on what Brigham Young was divining from God and how to make laws. So he was kind of like the high priest, the king, if you will, of that settlement. And they got along fine for a while, but then there became some challenges. And in 1853, Bridger was accused of selling alcohol and guns to the Ute Indians. We don't know whether it's true or not, but we do know that Bridger was charged not only with that, but was charged with treason against the United States of America. That was the charge that Brigham Young brought against him. That carries a very severe penalty, including death, treason. A posse of 80 men came to arrest Bridger. Bridger escaped, supposedly went up a tree, had a telescope, and he was hiding in an eagle nest high in a tree and just observing what was going on because his wife and children were still at the fort. They did keep meticulous roll of how much whiskey they drank and how many goods that they took and what was there. But Bridger obviously could not stay where he was, but he was very upset. One of the themes of this book, as I said, is to find a home. And now his home, and more importantly, Mary's home, his Shoshone wife and their children, that she now and he have to leave the Shoshone area because of these charges against Bridger. So going back to Thomas Fitzpatrick, oops, I'm going the wrong way. In Christmas Day of 1853, Bridger has been taken away from his home. What recourse does he have? He decides he's going to go to Washington, D.C. It's about a 2-week journey. We don't know if he went by train or by wagon. And Thomas Fitzpatrick went with him, and Thomas Fitzpatrick wanted to work on a new Indian treaty for some of the Indians on the southern plains. So they traveled together, and the records show that they checked into Brown's Hotel, which is on Pennsylvania Avenue between the White House and the Capitol, very close to where the old post office building was, which now is the Trump Towers. And so they checked in on January 6th. By February, Fitzpatrick contracted pneumonia, and he died in Washington, D.C. at that Brown's Hotel. One of their best friends was Robert Campbell, and he was also their banker. He was also there. So Bridger and Robert Campbell were there in Fitzpatrick's last days. So what was Bridger doing? Well, he was trying to say that his fort had been taken from him illegally. I'm going to use some profane language spoken by Brigham Young, or written by Brigham Young. Brigham Young, when he heard that Congress was going to diminish the size of Utah Territory, because they were, once they heard what Bridger said that he had taken his fort, they said, I will just cut up some of Utah Territory and give it back to Nebraska Territory. Brigham Young was so young, he said, and he's writing to his ambassador there, and you tell members of Congress that if their Bridger is the oracle of all things west, kiss my ass, damn you. And then those 5 lines are crossed out, but they're still there, just with a line running through it. And either Brigham Young himself or his clerk decided to cross it out. But then Brigham Young continued with his letter and said, but you tell members of Congress that if their Bridger were to come back and act the way he did before, even under the laws of the United States, he would be hanged between the heavens and the earth. So Bridger obviously is not going to be able to come back and say, hey, that's my fort. He's not able to say, hey, well, let's make a deal. I may sell it to you, I may not. He did agree to sell the fort, he and Vasquez, in 1855 for $9,000. But 7,500 of that was the horses and the mules and the oxen and all the goods at the fort that the Mormons had taken. The fort itself, which was actually probably showing about $10,000 of gross revenue every year, he got $1,450 for it. So that's why he felt bitter about this the rest of his life and felt that while he did sell his fort, he got nowhere near what it was worth, and he was forced out of his home, and his wife was forced to go away from her Shoshone people, and they built a home in Kansas City, actually Westport. But Bridger still spent almost all of his time out here in the West. So Kit Carson was a very good friend of Bridger, and they worked together in a lot of instances. But there was one instance, first I'll talk about an instance where they were actually very much on the same side. It was 1837, February of 1837, a year almost to the day later than the Alamo, where Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie and Travis and others were killed and were overwhelmingly surrounded. Bridger was leading these men, including Kit Carson, and they were about 100, maybe a little bit less, 80 men, and they were on the Yellowstone River, and about 400 Blackfeet show up, and the number starts to grow. And Bridger starts climbing up a hillside and looking with his telescope, and they say, what are you doing? He says, I'm just looking for squalls, the storms, but really he's looking for how many Blackfeet are gathering. So he tells his men to start building a fort. And then he goes up and comes down again. He said, you need to fortify. It needs to be higher. It needs to be thicker, because we're really going to be having a tremendous battle here. So Kit Carson, I think he said there were 1,500. Another one, Isaac Rose, said there's at least 1,400. Another one said there's 1,300. That many warriors were gathered around these 80 men 1 year after the Alamo. Were they going to have the same fate? A very unusual thing happened. After several days, they kept reinforcing the barricades, and Carson was following Bridger's orders throughout this. Suddenly, the northern lights appeared at night, and the part of the sky over the Blackfeet Indians turned blood red. And the next morning, the Blackfeet rode forward, and the chief put a flag into the ground, a white flag, and they rode off. We don't know why. They might have seen that as a token that they were, that this is what the spirits are telling them, or they might have felt that Bridger had built a strong enough fort that they would be able to withstand, being a siege of 1,400 or 1,500 men. So that's an instance where Bridger and Carson worked well together. The very next year, smallpox by this time has come up the Missouri River, and Congress was not blind to this. Congress actually allocated $12,000 to inoculate the Indians on the Missouri River. And that was to pay for the vaccine and the doctors who needed to administer it. And they started at St. Louis, and they went to Kansas City, and they kept going up north. They didn't even make it to the Mandan Indians, and the Mandans lost almost 90% of their population. And the disease continued going up to the Blackfeet. And the Blackfeet had been the enemies of these trappers for a long time. They had had a lot of skirmishes. But now, Bridger's leading these men along, and Carson's one of them, and they start to see dead people being left behind. This is a village of Blackfeet, men, women, and children, and they're starting to see the dead bodies with the marks on their face, and they realize that their people are dying. Kit Carson says, this is a tremendous opportunity. We can now take revenge against the Blackfeet for all the thievery and killing that they've done of our men. And Joe Meek agrees with them, and Osborne Russell agrees with them. Jim Bridger says, no, we're not going to do that. These people are suffering, so we're not going. And they say, we are going. So they went because they're free trappers. They're not under contract. But Bridger said, I'm not going, and none of my men are going, and we're staying here. We're just protecting the goods of the brigade. So in that particular incident, Kit Carson and Jim Bridger had a pretty significant disagreement of what to do, how to handle this situation. Do you attack the Blackfeet who are suffering from smallpox, or you just let them go? So they did attack Carson and Meek and Russell, and then they came to the 1838 rendezvous, and they boasted about how many they had killed. And the missionaries who were coming out, they're horrified at this story that these trappers had done this. They didn't say Bridger did it, but they said Bridger's men had done that. But so there was this. That just shows a difference between Carson, who's somewhat mercurial, and Bridger maybe was a little bit more prudent or thoughtful. But they were good friends and stayed that. This is Washakie, who was another very good friend. So let's jump to another stage of Bridger's life. This is his exploration era. He doesn't have a fort anymore. He's living over here in Kansas City, and he starts to be a guide. And Stansbury comes out in 1849, and Bridger said, I know a way to go from Fort Bridger over to Salt Lake. This is Ogden right here. And Stansbury was delighted with it, and so Bridger showed it to him. Afterwards, Bridger said, I don't know if I'm ever going to put myself through that again. I'm never going to have a headstrong Army commander tell me that I'm wrong and that I don't know my way. Stansbury was, I think, had seen the model of John C. Frémont, who very egotistically wrote about all of his exploits and became somewhat of a national hero. And Stansbury wanted to be the same. And Bridger said, you don't go that way. And he said, no, we will go that way. Anyway, Bridger did give in, and he guided Stansbury again on their route, this route here, to get to Fort Laramie this way instead of going along the Platte River. And they go through a place called Bridger Pass, which Bridger didn't discover. Ashley had been through it in 1825. The Cherokee Trail went like this through that same pass. But Bridger found one of the best passes through that bit of mountains. But this path became the Overland Trail, then it became the railroad trail, and it's more or less where Highway 20 goes today. I mean, Highway 80 goes today. He guided Gore, who was a slob hunter who hunted way more buffalo than needed, and he's all over the place here. More interestingly, he guided G.K. Warren, who was one of the best map makers in the United States at that time, and he was mapping this whole region of Nebraska, Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming. And with him was one of the most noted scientists of the time, Ferdinand Hayden. Ferdinand Hayden, just 2 years earlier, had discovered the first fossil bones of the dinosaurs in North America. It was a short journey, but he took them down the Yellowstone to the Powder and back, and there's all kinds of the official narrative of what they're hearing about Bridger. They named one camp, Fort Bridger's Camp. He built this bull boat here. He was asked about Yellowstone. He told him all about Yellowstone. And throughout his time, he told about Yellowstone. So when these guys get back, G.K. Warren, he gets back to Kansas City, and he tells the editor of the Kansas City newspaper about the amazing things that Bridger told him about Yellowstone. The editor writes it all up, and then his friends tell him, if you publish that, you'll be laughed out of town. You cannot publish Jim Bridger's lies. So he was really just going to tell the truth because Bridger always told the truth, and then when they didn't believe him, then he stretched it a little bit. But interestingly enough, Bridger told this to every one of these people he told about Yellowstone, and many of them recorded it. And it wasn't until 1872, I think it was, that the Yellowstone became the first national park in the world. And at that point, this editor who refused to tell Jim Bridger's story back in 1856, he printed a public apology to Jim Bridger and said, I never should have doubted Jim Bridger at the time. I shouldn't have said it was lies. And so it just shows, Bridger actually, he said, I don't mind telling somebody what's the truth, but if then they say that I'm a liar, then I'm either going to snarl and walk away or I'm going to tell them a whopper of a tale. And that's just the way he felt about it. One of the more significant ones, so I mentioned that Brigham Young had very, very much disregard for Congress and the president, and he did. And so in 1857, Bridger guided Alexander and then Johnston. Supposed to be a troop, a gathering of 2,500 men from Fort Laramie, actually Fort Leavenworth, all the way out to Salt Lake to basically tell Brigham Young that he's no longer the governor of Utah Territory. Albert Cummings is. So he was chief guide of that. Then he was chief guide for Reynolds and Berthoud and Collins in 1862. And here's a close-up of a map. They wanted to go from Fort Laramie, which is here, to Fort Halleck, which is over here. And there was a normal way to go along the Laramie River, the Civil Creek, back to the Laramie River. On the way back, said, let's just take the direct route. And Bridger showed them this route right here. And it's described in the book and the various stops, like stop near a perilous cliff. And it shows the route in the book about that. So this is one of Wyoming's top artifacts that they have in their collection. It's at the American Heritage Center. This is, now we get into a last part of Bridger's significant historical life. And this is called the Hanging of the Chiefs. And you can see scaffolds. And General Connor in 1865 and Colonel Moonlight in 1865, they both ordered that these chiefs, who were responsible for misusing white women that they had captured and taken as hostage, but the punishment was to have them hanged in public and not taken down, and their bodies stay up. And it was a very disgraceful way to punish them, and Bridger warned them vigorously that this would lead to tremendous death along the tribes. So Bridger was trying to be protective, and he guided Army soldiers when he had to, or when he had that job, but he tried to stop their excesses. So we come to the issue of the Bozeman Trail and the Bridger Trail. In 1863, as you know, gold is discovered in Virginia City, and later in Helena, and a lot of this region this is gold territory. And Bozeman tries to create a route in 1863, and he then decides that he's going to take a very large group of, he was told to come back, by the way. He said he's going to take a very large group and go along this Bozeman route in 1864. Jim Bridger knew that that would lead to war, because that area is land, this is on the east side of the Bighorn Mountains, and it's controlled by the Lakota Sioux and the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. And there's a gentleman by the name of Red Cloud who said, you will not go this way. So Red Cloud actually stopped Bozeman in 1863 and said, do not go this way, you take the Blanket Road. Now, what does he mean by the Blanket Road? Bridger's Indian name was Cassipi, which means blanket chief. And so what Red Cloud's really saying is, do not take the Bozeman Trail, take the Bridger Trail. And this was not as convenient. There wasn't as much forage for the animals. Water wasn't as plentiful, but life was protected this way. And the Crow welcomed Bridger and said, in fact, they said, where is Bridger? We haven't seen Bridger for years. We want to see Bridger. We want to see more. And so they were very agreeable. that this area, which is now the west side of the Bighorns, that this Bridger Trail would be taken. So driving over here, I went by the town of Bridger, and there's a sign that says a woefully inadequate trail. And they're talking about the Bridger Trail. And they're saying the Bridger Trail runs through here, woefully inadequate. And it concludes by saying that historians estimate that only 450 people took the Bridger Trail in 1864, which is flat out wrong. It's an old sign. It's been probably up there for 30 years. 2,500 people took the Bridger Trail in 1864, compared to only 1,500 took the Bozeman Trail. Bridger did this because not so much that he was, passionately supportive of the Lakota, because they have been doing a lot of raiding, but he knew that this is a peaceful way and it would be less death for American soldiers and for Indians. The United States government decided no to the Bridger Trail. We're going this way, right through the Lakota territory. That led to hundreds and hundreds of deaths among both sides, and it led to tens and tens of millions of dollars of U.S. expenditure. They built first Fort Connor, then it became Fort Reno, because Connor was had ruined his reputation by telling them to kill every Indian, telling his soldiers, every Indian over 12, to kill every male Indian over 12. And they built Fort Phil Kearny, and they built Fort C.F. Smith. And you know about the Fetterman battle? People heard about that? There's another name for it. Who knows the other name for it, the Indian name? 100 in the hand. The Lakota still call that battle 100 in the hand. And I've got enough time to tell you that story. There was a man, this is described by George Bird Grinnell. There was an Indian who believed that he was a she. And he was with this group of Sioux, and they were wondering, December 21st, is this the day that we're going to defeat the soldiers at Fort Phil Kearny? So he comes out of the group, and he's riding a horse, and he's playing a flute, and he has a mask over his face, and he's zigzagging his horse. And he comes back and he says, I have found the enemy. How many did you find? 10. That is not enough. That we are not going to war for 10. He does the same thing and comes back. How many did you find? 30, 40. Finally, he comes back and said, how many did you find? And he does this 10 times. 100 in the hand. And they said, that is enough of an enemy. We will now go and decoy the soldiers away from the fort, and we will kill them. And the Lakota to this day still call that the 100 in the hand. There's a statement from a soldier who was there at Fort Phil Kearny for most of that year. I guess it's about here. He writes this: James Bridger was with us all the summer of 1866, up until late in the fall. If Colonel Carrington and the officers had followed the advice of Bridger, I do not think there would have been nearly as many of our men killed. He told the officers not to follow the Indians and to send more men on escort duty, but they thought he was old and did not know anything about Indian warfare. Well, it was Fetterman and Grummond and Carrington who did not know anything about Indian warfare. It was a very tragic moment in American history, tragic on both sides. There were later battles, the wagon box fight and others, where there was a tremendous number of death on the part of the Sioux. So I attribute a lot of Bridger's attitude towards the Indians to his early life when he was living with the Potawatomis, and his friendly life with the Shoshone and the Crow, and his marriage to the Flathead and the Ute. And in fact, 2 years after this, in 1868, Jim Bridger applies to become the Indian agent for the Crow Indians. And he got top support from the head of the military in the United States. He supported that, but it wasn't his decision to make, and so a different choice was made. But Bridger still wanted, even in 1868, once he was no longer needed anywhere at these forts, he wanted to come back and live among the Crow and be their Indian agent. So what interested me about this character is, one, what a tremendous contribution he made to American history. Two, what an example he is. He wasn't perfect by any means, but what an example he is of living peacefully or coexisting with others, with the other. And three, that too many people have forgotten about this tremendous story. In the 1820s, he was thought he was the character to be on Mount Rushmore. Now people know that there's towns and villages and forests named after him, but do they know all this tremendous story of his history, and do they know the man himself and come to know his humor, his integrity, and his personality? And that's why I wrote this book, and that's why I'm glad that you came to hear me today. So I'd be glad to take any questions or comments from any of you. Yes?
How did Jim Bridger and some of these other guys like Jeremiah Johnson navigate around when initially there was no maps, and how did they know where they were going?
Well, many times they asked the Indians. And there's a classic example. When South Pass was discovered, so to speak, well, it was first, discovered early on, but Jedediah Smith supposedly went through in 1824. James Clyman records this in his journal. And first they tried to cross Union Pass, and it was still late winter. It was so cold they had to come back to the Crow Village. And so Clyman is trying to, and they have an interpreter, but he's not very good. So he's trying to build the mountains to show the Wind River Mountains, and he makes piles of sand. And then he explains, wanting to go across, how to get through. And the Crow Indians laughed, and they smeared it all flat, and they built new piles of sand. It showed it exactly where, and then they drew the path. I don't think I'll show on this slide, but they showed the path that you would go down to the southern border of the Wind River Mountains, and there you can cross. So many times, even without being able to speak the language, they were able to learn that. But Bridger was constantly making maps, drawing maps in the sand. Like there's a record of someone came to Fort Bridger, and they said, is there another way that we can get, instead of going the Mormon Trail, can we go another route? And Bridger immediately went to the fireplace, and he got a stick with char at the end, and he starts drawing on the door of his house. And his wife, Mary, she's probably thinking, what are you doing? But he's drawing, and he's showing how he should go. But then he said, but then again, are you on wagons? He said, yes, we're on wagons. He said, well, then I do not think you should go this route. But there was a lot of sharing. There was some map making. But Bridger did a huge map in 1851. 1851, they gathered about 10,000 Indians, the largest assembly of native peoples in North America ever known to history. And the idea was to make a grand peace treaty which would stop all the warfare. And they needed to do the boundaries. Jim Bridger was selected to draw in the dirt the boundary of the Crow people, the Sioux people, all the different groups along the plains. And Tom Fitzpatrick was part of that as well. Father Pierre de Smet was there, and he was recording it exactly. He was a very learned drawer. And that became the treaty document of what each of these 10 tribes would have. And so by 1851, Bridger knew the boundaries of all these, and the rivers were the primary markers. It's amazing to me, because as I drive along, even today, and I'm looking I'm thinking of the interstate. If I didn't have this road and I didn't have the signs, every hill looks like every other hill. How would I know which? I mean, I know north-south and east-west from the sun, but other than that, are you really on Clark's Fork, or are you, on a different river? And it's remarkable to me. So part of it, I don't have a full answer other than there's some people, and Bridger is one of the most well-known for having the full map of the West in his head. And that was one of his most distinctive characteristics.
Yeah, that just amazes me how they
Yeah, me too. Yes?
So why did they take all their furs up to Missouri instead of going down the Platte? The Platte too shallow?
Well, the Platte is too shallow for boats. The reason they went up with supplies and went down the Missouri with the pelts was because it was deep enough and they could float them down on keelboats. And then they started going along on the Platte. At least the Platte was a source of water, but it wasn't really. Tom Fitzpatrick tried in 1825, I think it was, and he made a bull boat and tried to go down the Platte, and it upended and he lost some things. So it wasn't really good for floating, but it was good to have water to drink every day. Yes?
Has your later studies found that has that been firmly?
No, it's not really totally debunked, but I do point out, and one of the most significant things that I found was a treasure trove of information at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And there was a man named James Stevenson who was, well, there was a professor there at Madison in the 1880s who was writing 20 famous people, and he had 20 questions about Jim Bridger. And I was able to only track down answers from 3 of them, but I found his answers at the University of Wisconsin. And James Stevenson, he gets to this, I'll preface it with something else. Stevenson said that he and Bridger tented and hunted together. Bridger for game, he hunted for game as meat, and I in the capacity of assistant naturalist in quest of animals and birds for the Smithsonian Institution. Stevenson took a professional interest in Bridger and said that he studied Bridger, quote, almost as an object of natural history. And then he said, Bridger's memory was an encyclopedia. He had a vivid and evidently rapid recollection of the details of events. While sitting at the campfire, he could recite hundreds of events that occurred. And then he says, I was with him on 2 occasions when the Indians attacked us. And I know of one, I don't know what the other one was yet. I'd like to find out. And I had the opportunity to observe his tact and coolness, which satisfied me that Bridger's stories of the many fights he had with the Blackfeet, the Bannocks, and others were not colored. They were not made up. They were true. So in answer to this professor's question, did Jim Bridger abandon Hugh Glass? Stevenson wrote, Bridger told me about your Hugh Glass, and there was no desertion. That's word for word. The way I take it, Bridger knows there was a desertion, but it was no desertion by him. So this is Stevenson saying that, and Stevenson actually worked with Bridger, not only hunted and tented, but came to his house, met his wife. For many weeks, he actually wrote letters for Bridger, and he read letters that Bridger was receiving. And so Stevenson had the foremost respect for Bridger. That doesn't conclude it, but the most significant thing, I think, is this. The only person who said Bridges, nobody ever said Bridger, but Bridges, was Edmund Flagg. And Edmund Flagg made about 8 very significant errors in that whole narrative. But it's still kind of a guess. History is not like science under a microscope. It's just how much information you could gather.
Well, I don't want to cut you off. I do want to say that if anybody wants to pick up the book and get it signed, you might make a mad dash before the store closes here. You can keep talking and answering questions if people want to grab the book and come back and get it signed, or you can move out and you can sign books in the lobby, either way.
Yeah. Well, as a matter of fact, he wants me to sign the books there too in the lobby. Okay. So maybe we can adjourn to the lobby and we can still do questions, and I'll just speak louder. And
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay, good.